At 11:47 a.m. on November 13th, 2025, in the marble corridors of the Longworth House office building, Congressman Riley Moore's hand trembled slightly as he signed his name to the most controversial spending bill in recent memory. The ink wasn't even dry when his phone started buzzing with urgent messages. 3 floors above, in a secured conference room, Attorney General Letitia James was watching the live C-SPAN feed, her own legal fate hanging in the balance. This wasn't just about funding the government anymore. This was about survival. The bill Moore had just signed contained provisions that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between justice and politics. Hidden within the 2847 pages of legislative text was Section 2113, a provision allowing senators to sue federal law enforcement for up to $500,000 per violation if their communications were seized without notification. To most Americans, it was bureaucratic fine print. To James, it was a declaration of war against accountability itself. "They think they've cornered me," James whispered to her chief of staff as she closed the laptop. Her voice carried the controlled fury of someone who had spent years fighting power and refusing to bow. "They have no idea what they've just unleashed." The story began 6 weeks earlier when the federal government shuttered its doors for what would become the longest shutdown in American history. While 1.4 million federal workers went without pay and critical services ground to a halt, a different kind of battle was brewing in the shadows. Senate Democrats had blocked House Republicans' clean continuing resolution 15 times, holding the nation hostage over enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies. But the real fight wasn't about health care, it was about justice. Moore, a freshman congressman from West Virginia's coal country, had built his reputation on standing with President Trump's America First agenda. The grandson of former Governor Arch Moore Jr., Riley had welding grease under his fingernails and a master's degree from the National Defense University. He understood both the working class and the machinery of power. What he didn't understand was that he was about to become a pawn in a much larger game. As the shutdown dragged into its 6th week, Moore found himself in the epicenter of negotiations that went far beyond government funding. The appropriations bill he was crafting didn't just restore services, it rewrote the rules of political accountability. The $203.5 million for congressional security wasn't just about protection, it was about insulation. The $28 million for Supreme Court justice security wasn't just about safety, it was about separation from scrutiny. But it was Section 213 that revealed the true purpose of the legislation. Buried in the legislative branch appropriations was language that would retroactively allow senators to sue if their communications had been obtained by federal investigators without notification. The provision seemed to target the FBI's 2023 analysis of senator phone records during the investigation into Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. 8 senators and 1 congressman had their communications examined. Now they could each claim $500,000. And 300 miles away in New York, James was fighting her own battle for survival. The federal indictment hanging over her head for alleged bank fraud wasn't just a legal matter. It was Trump's revenge, pure and simple. She had defeated him in civil court, securing a $355 million judgment for inflating property values to defraud lenders and insurers. A divided appeals court had upheld Trump's liability but voided the excessive penalty. Both sides had appealed to the New York Court of Appeals. But Trump's victory in November had changed everything. The charges against James were threadbare at best. Prosecutors alleged she had misrepresented a Norfolk, Virginia property as her secondary residence instead of an investment property on a 2020 mortgage application, saving $18,933 over the life of the loan. Career prosecutors had initially declined to bring charges, finding insufficient evidence for conviction. But after Trump's Truth Social post, calling on Attorney General Pam Bondi to take action against Letitia and others, the case had been fast-tracked under Lindsay Halligan, a prosecutor with no previous experience who had been installed after Trump fired her predecessor. "This is nothing more than a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system," James had said outside the Norfolk courthouse after pleading not guilty. Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent her career fighting corruption and now found herself in the crosshairs of the very system she had served. As Moore prepared for the final House vote on November 13th, he received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was calm, but urgent. House Speaker Mike Johnson needed to see him immediately. In Johnson's office, Moore found himself face to face with the harsh realities of political calculation. "Riley, you understand what this vote means?" Johnson said, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the tension. "This isn't just about keeping the lights on. This is about whether Congress can function under constant threat of criminal investigation." Moore shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair. "Sir, I understand the security provisions, but Section 213 protects the institution," Johnson interrupted. "When federal prosecutors can grab senator phone records without so much as a courtesy call, we're no longer a co-equal branch of government. We're targets." But Moore knew there was more to the story. The provision wasn't just about institutional protection. It was about retroactive immunity for senators who had been caught on the wrong side of January 6th investigations. It was about ensuring that future investigations would face prohibitive legal costs before they even began. "What about James?" Moore asked quietly. Johnson's expression hardened. "What about her? She made her choice when she went after a sitting president with a politically motivated prosecution. Actions have consequences." The pieces were falling into place. The shutdown had been leverage. The security provisions were cover. Section 2113 was retaliation. And Letitia James was the example, a warning to any prosecutor who dared to challenge power with law. At 2:15 p.m., as the House prepared to vote, James was in her Manhattan office, watching the proceedings with her legal team. The irony wasn't lost on her. A bill ostensibly about security was actually about insecurity. The insecurity of politicians who feared accountability. "If this passes," her attorney Abby Lowell said, "it changes the calculus for every federal prosecutor. Do you investigate a senator knowing it could cost the government $500,000? Do you subpoena records knowing you'll face a lawsuit?" James stood and walked to the window overlooking Manhattan's skyline. The city stretched out below her, millions of people depending on the rule of law to protect them from the abuse of power. She had spent her career fighting for those people. As a public defender, as a city councilwoman, as public advocate, and now as attorney general. She wouldn't stop now. "They think fear will silence justice," she said, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "They're about to learn they're wrong." The vote was closer than anyone expected. 22 to 219. Every Republican voted yes, joined by 8 Democrats who broke ranks. Riley Moore's signature on the bill wasn't just procedural, it was historic. He had helped create the legal framework that would shield politicians from the kind of investigation that had brought down Richard Nixon and countless corrupt officials since. But as Moore walked out of the Capitol that evening, his phone buzzed with a text message that made his blood run cold. It was from a reporter at the Washington Post. "Congressman, are you aware that Section 2013 was drafted by the same legal team representing you in the ethics investigation into your campaign finances?" Moore stopped walking. He had thought he was protecting the institution. Instead, he had been protecting himself. And he hadn't even known it. The provision he had championed would shield him from the very investigation that could end his political career, before it truly began. Meanwhile, in Norfolk, Virginia, James was preparing for her arraignment, scheduled for October 24th. The federal courthouse was surrounded by supporters and protesters, the scene a microcosm of a nation divided between those who believed in accountability and those who prioritized loyalty. James emerged from her car in a dark blue suit, her bearing regal despite the circumstances. "There's no fear today. No fear," she told the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. "Because I believe that justice will rain down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream." Inside the courtroom, U.S. District Judge Jamar K. Walker, a Biden appointee with experience prosecuting financial crimes, presided over the arraignment. James entered her plea personally, her voice clear and unwavering, "Not guilty." But the real drama was playing out in the motions being filed simultaneously. James's legal team was challenging not just the charges, but the very authority of prosecutor Lindsay Halligan to bring them. They argued that Halligan's appointment was illegal, that her predecessor had already served the maximum 20 days allowed for interim prosecutors, and that Trump's scheme to circumvent Senate confirmation was a constitutional violation. "This is nothing more than a transparent attempt to weaponize the Justice Department against the president's political enemies," Lowell argued in court filings. When career prosecutors concluded there was insufficient evidence to bring charges, the president simply installed a prosecutor who would do his bidding. The case was assigned to Judge Cameron McGowan Curry in South Carolina, who would hear the constitutional challenges in December. But James wasn't waiting for legal vindication. She was fighting back on every front. 3 days after Moore's bill became law, James filed a motion challenging the appointment of U.S. Attorney John Sarcone in the Northern District of New York, who had issued subpoenas seeking information about her investigations into the Trump Organization and the National Rifle Association. The motion, initially filed under seal, alleged that the subpoenas were retaliatory and violated her First Amendment rights and New York state sovereignty. They want to silence me with indictments, intimidate me with subpoenas, and bankrupt me with legal fees. James said in a statement, "But they've forgotten something fundamental. I didn't get into public service to be popular. I got into it to do what's right." The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Riley Moore and a Republican Party determined to shield itself from accountability through legislation and litigation. On the other stood Letitia James, fighting for the principle that no one, not even the most powerful, is above the law. The stakes couldn't be higher. If James's prosecution succeeded, it would establish the precedent that Trump's Justice Department could criminally target any prosecutor who dared to challenge Republican officials. If she prevailed, it would preserve the independence of state prosecutors and the rule of law itself. But the fight wasn't just legal, it was existential. James represented everything Trump and his allies feared: a woman of color who refused to be intimidated, a prosecutor who followed evidence wherever it led, a public servant who put duty above political expediency. As winter settled over Washington, the parallel dramas played out in courtrooms and committee rooms across the nation. Moore, once proud of his role in ending the shutdown, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about power and principle. The ethics investigation into his campaign finances was accelerating, and Section 2013, the provision he had helped pass, was his only lifeline. James, meanwhile, was preparing for the fight of her life. Her trial was scheduled for January 26th, just 6 days after Trump's inauguration. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had defeated Trump in civil court would face his criminal justice system almost immediately after he returned to power. The final confrontation came on December 5th during the hearing on James's motion to dismiss the charges as selective prosecution. The courtroom in Norfolk was packed with reporters, supporters, and observers who understood they were witnessing a historic moment. Prosecutor Halligan, despite her inexperience, was forceful in her arguments. The defendant believes she is above the law because of her political position. She defrauded a financial institution and must be held accountable like any other citizen. But James's attorney, Abby Lowell, was devastating in his response. "Your Honor, this prosecution is the culmination of a campaign of retribution that began the moment my client successfully held the president accountable in civil court." Career prosecutors examined this exact evidence and concluded there was insufficient basis for charges. Only after the president publicly demanded action was this case brought by a prosecutor with no experience and questionable authority. Judge Walker took the arguments under advisement, but the damage was done. The hearing had exposed the political underpinnings of the prosecution in a way that no amount of legal argument could refute. As 2025 drew to a close, the parallel stories of Riley Moore and Letitia James had become the defining narrative of American politics. The collision between power and accountability, between loyalty and law, between fear and justice. Moore, the freshman congressman who had wanted to make a difference for his West Virginia constituents, found himself trapped in the very system he had thought he was reforming. The ethics investigation was closing in, and his political future hung in the balance of the provisions he had helped write. James, the career prosecutor who had never backed down from a fight, faced the ultimate test of her principles. Her legal fate would determine not just her future, but the future of prosecutorial independence in America. The question that hung over both of them was simple but profound. In a system where power protects itself and justice stands alone, who would ultimately prevail? The answer would come in the new year, in courtrooms where the Constitution itself would be on trial, where the fundamental question of American democracy would be decided. Are we a nation of laws or a nation of men? As snow fell on the Capitol dome and the lights in Letitia James's office burned late into the night, two truths were becoming clear. Riley Moore had learned that in politics, good intentions can pave the road to hell, and Letitia James was about to prove that sometimes, the only way to serve justice is to risk everything for it. The final chapter of their stories was yet to be written, but one thing was certain: the outcome would define American democracy for generations to come. In the end, the biggest question wasn't whether justice would prevail, but whether America still had the courage to demand it. The oldest lesson is always the truest. Power fears accountability, but accountability needs someone brave enough to stand and deliver it. The question for America was simple: would that someone survive long enough to see justice done? What do you think? When power writes the laws to protect itself, can justice still find a way? Let us know in the comments. Like and subscribe for more stories from the corridors of power, where principle meets politics, and the stakes are nothing less than democracy itself.